Lyndon Forbes Sampson Bonham, well known as the master politician and was an outstanding statesman. He was a great leader and our hero, you understand. That's why we remember L.F.S. Bonham.
Yes, morning to you once again. I'm with you once again with the state of the nation. Today we will be looking at a few things, making some announcements, looking back and see what the foundation has been doing over the past weeks and months, and also to tell you too what we will be doing in the future. For those of us, I want to start off by saying that this month is the month of the elderly. It is being kind of celebrated worldwide, and I want to take this opportunity to give my respect and special tribute to the elderly of Guyana. Today they call them senior citizens. So best wishes and good luck to all the senior citizens of Guyana. This is your month. You know, a lot of things happening this month. They were also looking at agricultural month and statistics day, and a number of things have been occurring this month, education month, but it is the month of the elderly. I have with me in the studio today Mr. Vincent Alexander, chairman of the foundation and also technical advisor to the Minister of Education, former registrar of the University of Guyana. We'll be looking at Forbes Bonham and his interests and his policies in relation to the elderly, senior citizens. And then we're going to talk about Forbes Bonham and education. What is it about Forbes Bonham that informed his approach to education? But before we go into that, I want to take this opportunity to introduce Mr. Alexander to our viewers and to tell you that we will go right away into our discussion in relation to Lyndon Forbes Sampson Bonham's role and his interests in the senior citizens of Guyana.
Thank you very much, and good morning to the viewers out there. When one talks about Lyndon Forbes Sampson Bonham, one is speaking about someone who had an interest, not in any one sector, but in the citizens at large and in his country at large. The senior citizens obviously would represent one such sector of people. And Bonham, in his attempt to respond to the needs of his people and of his country, would have attempted to develop policies that would affect all categories of people. I think when one talks about senior citizens, it is arguably the most significant thing that Bonham did was the creation of the National Insurance Scheme. Because it is that National Insurance Scheme, the legacy of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Bonham, which today provides many of those senior citizens with some form of subsistence, some recourse to financial resources that can keep them going in these times. And so I think that is the most significant contribution Bonham would have made in terms of impact on the lives of senior citizens. And Bonham made this contribution in a hostile environment, because when Bonham sought to introduce the National Insurance Scheme, there were those propagandists who used the acronym NIS to reverse it and to call it SIN. And so they sought to say it was sinful for Bonham to have imposed upon people to have to make a contribution to the national insurance, to their national insurance. As you know, in terms of the National Insurance Scheme, the employer makes a contribution and the employee makes a contribution. So it's a contributory scheme. And it was highly criticized by the then opposition. It was referred to as sin, and people in fact were discouraged from being involved in the scheme, which is mandatory for all employed persons in Guyana.
I want to, I want to intervene here, Vincent, and to. You said it was created in a very hostile environment. I tend to share closest with that view because other than using the acronym to say, and they call it SIN, they also said, I remember quite clearly in Berbice, I was working at the time, when they had said that it meant new ideas to steal, the NIS. But what I wanted to kind of find, in fact, it has been proven now that the NIS has been one of those outstanding institutions that were established by Forbes Burnham. But I needed to, for you to just kind of zoom in, what was the environment like at that time in terms of employment and the need to make a contribution towards the scheme.
Well, when I talked about the hostile environment, I was talking about then opposition and the way in which they addressed the workers. And I dare say, in some regards, the sugar workers in particular, saying to them that this was almost an evil act on the part of Burnham to introduce this scheme and to have them make a contribution to the scheme. But it is those same workers today who are the beneficiaries, and in some regards, sometimes this is the only benefit they have of the contribution that they would have made. Bearing in mind that the state also contributed, so it was not just the worker who contributed, it was the state that contributed, and now they're getting the returns in terms of their pension, and there's some other benefits. The workers can still get their vouchers for specs and some elements of the medical. Even as Burnham introduced that scheme, one could have seen his leadership not only in Guyana, but his leadership across the Caribbean. Guyana was the first country to introduce national insurance. Subsequently, other Caribbean countries followed in that path and also introduced national insurance. I think, if I'm not mistaken, they have it in Barbados, I think they have it in Grenada,
Antigua.
they have it in
Antigua
Antigua.
too.
And even as we speak, there is an element of superiority to what Burnham introduced, because in some of those countries, the scheme does not provide the medical aspect. But the national insurance, as Burnham introduced it, also provided for medical aspect. Today we are focusing on the elderly, and the medical aspect is not that much relevant to the elderly, except to say that under the scheme, the rule was that if a person was diagnosed with a particular ailment prior to retirement and prior to entitlement to pension, then if the person continued to have that ailment after retirement during the period of pension, then the scheme would also continue to contribute to the health bill of that person. So in that regard too, the elderly was being catered for. I think there's been some deviation from that in recent times, but that was also part of what the scheme provided for. And so we have this scheme that also provided not only leadership for a similar scheme in the rest of the Caribbean,
In the world.
but it became an integrated scheme in the Caribbean, because what was then worked out was a collaboration between the national insurers across the Caribbean that allowed for someone who migrated from one country to another to have a join-in of the contributions made in one country to the country in which he or she might have migrated, and therefore to have those contributions counted towards their benefits in another country. So it became an integrated Caribbean scheme in that regard. And very little is said these days about the way in which Burnham was the mastermind of the National Insurance Scheme, and how that scheme has impact on the lives of Guyanese, and how the scheme, having been adopted across the Caribbean, has impacted the lives of other Caribbean people, and particularly in this instance we're focusing on its impact on the elderly, because to a large extent, the scheme deals with people who it deals with pregnant women. Its impact there significantly. It deals with any kind of sickness during the period of contribution. It deals with the vouchers for spectacles. But all of these are kind of incidental things. They may or may not happen. But pray God, all of us become elderly, and that is the part where there's almost a certainty of the benefit to be derived, the pension that the elderly are paid. Now, even as we discuss this scheme and we discuss the legacy, we have to be able to express our concern about what has become or is becoming of the scheme, because we know that the last government in some regards used the scheme as a milking cow, and it became a source of loans for the private sector, and that there were some private sector undertakings, including the Burbage Bridge, that got substantial sums from the scheme, but the scheme has not been the best beneficiary of those deals. The scheme, for example, in the case of the Burbage Bridge, I don't think is one of the shareholders who are presently getting returns on their shares. And a scheme like the NIS is, in a sense, doomed to failure unless it gets returns on its investment. Because the reality is that the monies paid by the contributors, the employees, and the employer, in absolute terms, cannot sustain the scheme. What is required for that scheme, and like for any other insurance or assurance scheme, is that as people pay, those monies are wisely invested. And so the scheme is maintained partly by the returns on the investment. And we know that one of the investments the scheme was involved in was CLICO. And I think probably one of the things we ought to be asking for is the present government to give us information on what has happened with the CLICO's NIS's investment in CLICO. Has NIS been one of the bodies which have had their monies repaid? Because there were provisions made both in terms of the assets. I think, in fact, one of the things that happened is the building on Camp Street.
Yes.
The GRA building was given to NIS as a part of the repayment, but I don't think that represented all of the money that NIS invested in CLICO. So that's one asset NIS has, and probably getting some income from it. But there are remaining sums, and not insignificant sums, that the public has not been told have been repaid. And in the interest of the sustenance of that scheme, I think we ought to pose the question, what has happened with the remaining amounts that were invested in CLICO, and to call on government to ensure that never again is the scheme used as a milking cow and put in a state of jeopardy by having investments which are not making returns that can sustain that scheme.
I think it's all in the interest of both the senior citizens as well as the elderly for that kind of information to be made available, because they have been the contributors to the scheme. And to add what you have said, I remember quite clearly a team from Tanzania came down to Guyana to look at our NIS structure and its operation at one time. I think we have two subjects particularly to cover today, but I want to bring you some update as to what has been happening with the foundation over the past weeks. We have had our inductees of our the kind of mentee. We have a mentorship scheme, and we have inducted so far 27 young people. These are children of parents who are members of the party that Father Bonham has founded, and also from the trade union, of which he was President General for life. So we have had so far 27 inductees in our scheme for this year. We have held so far two symposium. We had one in Georgetown that was addressed by the Foreign Minister, Mr. Carl Greenidge, and we had another one in Linden that was addressed by Mr. Raul Lucas, chairman of GRA and also a member of the foundation. We intend to have next week, Sunday, in New Amsterdam, Town Hall, I think it is, right, Vincent? At the Town Hall in New Amsterdam. We also have a symposium, and this time we'll be addressing the same subject, people in Amsterdam need to know what about the Guyana-Venezuela border controversy. We need to have that issue brought to the people of Berbice. So the foundation is having a symposium again in Amsterdam at the town hall from 5 o'clock.
From 5 o'clock.
From 5 o'clock on Sunday. You know, this is a topical issue. The Guyana-Venezuela border controversy is an issue that is being discussed now all over. And obviously the Venezuelans are trying to convince people about the rightness of their cause. We know this matter has been settled a long time ago. Our people need to be made aware. They need to be informed, and the foundation has taken upon itself to make sure that we hold this symposium. I remember doing a program on the radio, and a lady called in from Essequibo said, look, these people are claiming the Essequibo. You all need to bring the symposium here as well. Of course, we are looking at that, and the next one, I am sure, the executive of the foundation will take into account the lady's request, so we'll have another symposium somewhere in Essequibo, a date of which you will be
Clement,
informed.
on that one, I would say that a decision has already been taken. We have not finalized the date, but the decision has already been taken that we will go to Essequibo, because that's the affected area, and the
Yes.
people who will be most affected by what's happening, and so we find it obligatory to go to Essequibo, to have a symposium, to do some more enlightenment and public education on the question of the Venezuela-Guyana border controversy. So we will be coming to Essequibo. I'm told that some people from Essequibo now see Channel 9, so please look out. Burnham Foundation will be coming that way to do a symposium on the Guyana-Venezuela border controversy.
Yes, I'm glad. When the date is fixed, you will be informed. I know, and you, as well as I do, we all know, Forbes Burnham has been a very complex person. Like Mr. Alexander said in his introductory remarks, he took account of every sector of Guyana, not just the elderly. He took account of young people. He took account of sports. He took account of foreign policy. Everything Forbes Burnham took into account and made sure that his policies, the policy that he instituted that informed these areas were well kind of thought out. I want to look at Forbes Burnham now, Vincent, the month of education, Forbes Burnham and education. Forbes Burnham has been a stickler. In fact, he was very firm in his approach to education, and if I remember correctly, he was the first kind of minister of education in this country. Now, what is it about Forbes Burnham and education?
I want to start with the first point you made, that he was the first Minister of Education. That Burnham was the first Minister of Education is in itself a recognition of his fitness for purpose. Purpose here being the whole question of guiding the development of Ghana's education policy. So that in 1953, in the PPP government at that time, of which Burnham was the chairman of the PPP. There's a lot of history that's dropped and distorted and not made known to people. But for you young people out there, in 1953, when the PPP won the elections, it was not the present PPP that's in Rob Street. It was a PPP that consisted of Jagan and Burnham as, for want of a better term, the co-leaders, as Burnham was the chairman of that party. When that party won the elections, Burnham was made the first Minister of Education under the adult suffrage electoral system. Under the electoral system, where for the first time, once you were an adult, irrespective of the property you owned or did not own, once you were an adult over the age of 21, you were able to vote. And Burnham became the first Minister of Education under that government. An interesting thing is, if in the recent past you went to the Ministry of Education, you would have seen all of the pictures of all of the ministers, starting from C.V. Nunes to the exclusion of the first Minister of Education, Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. But that has been rectified. The picture of Burnham has now been mounted. It is now in its rightful place because he was. There's no dispute or argument about the fact that he was the first Minister of Education, 1953, after we got adult suffrage in Guyana. Now the question that arises is, what is this about Burnham and education? And Clayton, I would posit that Burnham's disposition to education was largely influenced by his own life experience and his emergent philosophical and ideological position. We hear from time to time about Burnham and how brilliant he was and things like that. But little do we know that in the days of Burnham, in the main, the people who went to QC went there because their parents could afford to pay a fee. QC was not the QC we know today, that is a free education institution.
Much more liberal.
It was one where you had to pay a fee, and there were a few scholarships granted to some of the better brains in the country. And so Lyndon Fobbs Sampson Burnham, when he left primary school, was not of the ilk of those who could pay that fee and proceed to QC. And therefore, for those who do not know, he first attended Central High School. It was a prestigious school at that time, and he attended that school. But there were opportunities, even as you attended high school, to acquire a scholarship. And I think Burnham acquired what is called the Percival Scholarship. And it is through that scholarship that Burnham was able to go to QC. And I make it a